I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the plainest way I can put it, without dressing it up. I was 52, on leave from the county road crew with my left shoulder wrapped and aching from a bad catch on a grader blade, living in my late mother's cedar-sided place at the edge of Coldwater Ridge because it cost me less than rent and asked fewer questions than people did. The house sat where the county gravel gave up and turned to ruts, with a narrow porch, a hand pump that still worked when it wanted to, and an orchard that had mostly gone wild except for one old apple tree that still produced if the weather gave it mercy. I'd spent most of my adult life fixing roads other folks used to get home. By then, I wasn't sure where mine was. The estrangement from my son had stretched to 2 years and a month by the time the leaves started going copper. That number lived in me like a splinter. His name was Ryan. He was grown, with his own mortgage, his own crew, his own ways of carrying hurt that I had helped build and didn't know how to undo. We hadn't had one dramatic blow-up so much as a pile-up of smaller failures. My temper at the wrong moment, his silence when I pushed, both of us convinced we were the one being reasonable. A primary consideration in that kind of break is pride, and pride is a poor carpenter. It can build a wall quick, but it can't build a door. I knew that. I still kept adding boards. Most mornings I woke before light, because pain doesn't honor clocks. The shoulder would throb where it met my neck, and I'd lie there counting the sounds the house made as it cooled. Pipe tick, rafter creak, the soft scratch of tractor's nails on old plank floor as he circled twice and dropped down by the wood stove. Tractor was 12, black and tan with a white chin and one ear that never stood all the way up, and he moved like a tired mechanic, practical and slow. I'd pull on jeans and a flannel, feed him kibble with a scoop of warm broth, and stand at the sink while the kettle hissed, looking through the wavering glass at rows of trees, gone thin and silver with dawn. Sometimes I could almost see my mother there, shoulders square, apron streaked with flour, calling out that I was late to the ladder again. Memory works that way. It arrives as if it owns the place. I ran myself on routine because routine kept me from sitting too long with what I'd lost. Split wood, one-handed and awkward. Stack it under the eave. Stop twice to stretch and swear quietly at my shoulder. Walk fence line with a spool of wire and pliers in my back pocket. Patch where deer had leaned through. Check the orchard. Kick windfall apples into separate piles for deer and compost. Note which limbs needed pruning once winter settled. Come in at dusk, microwave whatever could be called supper without breaking honesty. Then sit on the porch steps with tractor and watch the ridge darken from green to blue to black. It was a life made of tasks. It held together from the outside. Inside was looser. By the second week of October, everybody in town had started talking about black frost. That was what folks called an early hard freeze that came down the ridge, like a judgment, and took whatever crops were still pretending to have time. I heard it at Miller Feed when I went in for cracked corn and lamp oil. Old Ken Miller had his forearms on the counter, weather radio muttering beside the register, and he gave me that sideways look men reserve for injuries and divorces. "Shoulder any better?" "Depends what I'm lying about," I said. He snorted once. "Freeze line's pushing fast. You get those apples in, or you won't get another chance." "I know." He slid my change across and tapped the radio with one knuckle. "Tonight, maybe not. Next 10 days, keep your eye open." That was the whole exchange. Maybe 30 seconds, but it rode home with me. Not because of the apples as money. One tree doesn't make a business. It was tradition, and tradition is where grief does its finest work. For years, Ryan and I had done one weekend of apples at my mother's place, no matter what else was wrong. We'd fill wicker baskets, bruise our shins on the same exposed root, argue over pie spice like it mattered to national security, then send him home with jars and a couple crooked pies wrapped in foil. Even after his mother passed and the holidays got quieter, we still kept that weekend. Then we didn't. The year after that, we didn't again. Every skipped ritual grows teeth. That afternoon the sky carried a thin white glaze. High clouds spread like breath on cold glass, and the wind had a narrow edge to it that found gaps in my jacket. I set the old orchard ladder against the last producing tree, climbed 2 rungs, and felt the shoulder protest hard enough to light my eyes. I came back down and stood there with both boots in damp leaves, hand on the ladder rail, trying to decide whether stubbornness counted as strength. Tractor nosed my knee and huffed. I scratched his neck and laughed once at myself, a dry little sound. I had become a man negotiating with a dog about fruit. At supper, I ate standing up. Leftover beans, half a heel of cornbread, coffee too strong for that hour, and listened to the kitchen clock click at me. The house carried smells that never fully left. Cedar in the walls, old smoke in the beams, apples in the floorboards from decades of spills and peels and cider slosh. My mother used to say a good house remembers what fed it. This one remembered plenty. I wandered from sink to stove to window, plate in hand, and watched the yard flatten into evening. No headlights on the county road, no visitors, no reason to expect either. The phone sat face down on the table longer than it should have before I picked it up. There was one text from my sister, Mara. "You okay up there?" Heard Black Frost might hit early. I typed, "Fine, working on apples," then erased it. Typed, "I'm managing," sent that instead. She answered with a thumbs up and a canning jar emoji, which was her way of saying she loved me without making me dodge it. I stared at Ryan's name in my contacts for a while, the way a man stands at the edge of cold water talking himself out of 1 more minute on shore. Then I set the phone back down. Evidence suggests avoidance feels like control right up until you notice your world has shrunk to fit it. On the porch that night, Tractor leaned his warm weight against my shin while I watched a sliver moon hang over the ridge. You could hear a truck 3 miles off if the wind turned right. You could hear one acorn hit the roof, then another. You could hear your own breathing and decide what story it told. I told myself practical men don't wait for miracles. Practical men sharpen chains, salt the steps, and get on with what there is. The statement had a framework I trusted. Effort in, result out, no mysteries required. Yet I kept glancing toward the orchard as if waiting for permission I couldn't name. Near 9, coyotes sounded off from the far draw, thin and layered, and Tractor lifted his head, but didn't bark. He just listened, then settled again. I rubbed the knot where shoulder met neck and looked down the slope where the apple tree stood a darker shape among darker shapes. The baskets were overturned beside it, one with a split handle, one still sound. My ladder was there too, a grey line in low light. If the freeze came hard, I'd lose what was left by morning after next, maybe sooner. I pictured the fruit turning to glass under rime, flesh gone mealy, sweetness flattened. Strange what can break a man open at that age. Not catastrophe. A tree he couldn't harvest alone. I slept badly and woke twice with my arm numb. At first light, I pulled boots on without socks, forgot coffee, and walked straight to the orchard with Tractor weaving ahead through wet grass. Dawn had that muted look it gets before a weather turn. Colours held back. No sun edge yet over the ridge. Halfway down the slope I noticed the quiet. No jay chatter from the fence posts. No squirrel argument in the hickories. Even the usual wing-flick rustle in the low brush had gone still, as if the whole place was listening to something farther off than I could hear. The overturned picking crate by the tree caught my eye next, and I stopped with one hand on my hip and felt my breath change. On top of that crate centered neat as a church table, sat 4 windfall apples arranged in a cross, stems alternating out and in. Beside them lay 2 smooth creek stones, one pale grey, one dark green, set touching at one edge like matched halves. Not dropped, placed. Tractor trotted past me, went straight to the crate, sniffed once, then sat down beside it with his tail laid quiet on the ground, calm as Sunday. I stood there in the cold and looked from the apples to the stones to the tree line, and for the first time in a long while my grief moved over 1 inch to make room for curiosity. I didn't step closer right away. I stood there with my boots soaking through at the toes, staring at those apples and those stones like they might rearrange themselves into an answer if I was patient enough. Tractor kept sitting beside the crate, relaxed, mouth closed, not guarding it and not asking anything from me, just waiting. The quiet pressed around us so evenly it felt padded. No wing beats, no bark from the neighbour's place down the hollow. Even the little dry tick of oak leaves moving against each other had gone scarce. I finally moved in and crouched with my good arm braced on my knee. The apples were windfall fruit from my own ground, but somebody had wiped the mud off each one with care. Not polished, just cleaned enough to show skin through the dust. 2 had bruises turned outward, 2 didn't. The stones were creek-worn smooth, one cool grey with a white seam, the other green-black like wet slate. There wasn't a creek near the orchard. Nearest one was down the east draw, maybe a 1/4 mile through tangle and alder. I touched the edge where the 2 stones met. They were set exact, like a pair. "Tell me you dragged these up here," I said to Tractor. He blinked at me and looked away, which was his standard response whenever I asked him to support a theory he knew was weak. I picked up 1 apple and turned it in my hand. The stem had been tucked inward, deliberate as a knot tied square. I set it back where it had been. My shoulder throbbed from holding still too long, so I shifted, stood, and looked the tree line over 1 strip at a time. Maples thinning out. 2 young firs leaning together near the fence break. The old snag where woodpeckers nested every spring. Nothing moving, and yet I had that plain bodily feeling of not being alone in the way I'd been alone all fall. I told myself this couldn't be real in any meaningful way. There had to be a workable explanation. Neighbor kid fooling around before school, some hunter passing through, maybe Mara trying to cheer me up with a stunt and making it stranger than she meant to. The framework held for about 30 seconds, then gave out under details. Who came this far up my rutted road without a truck track? Who knew that overturned crate was where my mother used to set sorted fruit? Who would choose windfall apples and creek stones instead of a note if they wanted credit? I stood there arguing with evidence like it owed me comfort, and all it did was remain exactly what it was. The truth was I had been talking tough to myself for months, and still waking up at 3 with my jaw locked and my hands clenched. I had been eating at a counter because the table felt too big. I had been timing my days by pain medicine and weather radio and pretending that counted as resilience. In that orchard, with my dog sitting calm beside a little arrangement that made no sense, my certainty cracked in a place I hadn't defended. I wasn't scared. I was exposed. There's a difference. I pulled the split-handle basket upright and set it by the ladder, then started what I could manage from the ground. Reach, twist, ease fruit free with fingertips, lower it, not drop it. Tractor trailed me in a loose half-circle, occasionally nosing a fallen apple toward my boot like he'd been promoted to assistant foreman. After 5 minutes, I laughed under my breath because somewhere in the county there I was, one-armed and stiff, taking production support from a 12-year-old hound while trying to outwork a freeze. I actually said, "Good push, partner," to a dog and meant it. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, a faint yellow washed over the upper branches, and the frost that had silvered the grass melted into dark, wet soil. The stillness held. One jay finally called from far off, one sharp note, then shut up again. I worked slowly, shoulder burning on each lift, and every now and then I glanced at the crate. The cross stayed neat. The stones stayed touching. Nothing about it looked random once you'd seen it. I carried the first half basket to the porch and set it by the door, then came back down with the sound basket and a pair of old leather gloves I used when my grip got unreliable. Tractor drank from the stock tub by the barn, trotted after me and settled under the tree facing the woods instead of facing me. He looked alert but easy, like he was listening to a familiar person in another room. I watched him for a long moment before climbing one rung on the ladder and stopping when my shoulder flashed hot. "Nope," I muttered. "Not today." I climbed back down and leaned against the trunk, breathing through the ache. The bark was rough and cool through my shirt. Above me, apples hung red-yellow in little clusters, each one suddenly precious for no practical reason I could defend. It wasn't a crop. It was a thread, and I was tired of pretending threads didn't matter. I took my phone out, turned it over in my hand, then put it back in my pocket without unlocking it. I wasn't ready for people. I wasn't ready for hearing my own voice explain something I couldn't explain. The orchard asked nothing from me except honesty, and even that felt like work. A breeze came down from the ridge, thin and cold, and brought smells in layers. Damp leaves, split cedar from the porch stack, distant wood smoke from someone burning brush, and underneath it all, that sweet fermented apple scent that clung to old orchards in fall. I listened hard. At first there was nothing but my own breathing and Tractor's tags clicking once when he shifted. Then a small sound from the trees to my right. Not a crack, more like leaves pressed down by weight and released carefully. One step, pause. Another, farther back. Whatever made it moved with restraint, not the careless burst of deer or the rooting shove of bear. I froze and looked. No shape separated from shadow. The woods held their lines. "Morning," I said out loud before I could stop myself. My own voice sounded strange in that quiet, too loud and too plain. Tractor lifted his head, ears forward, tail low and steady against the ground. He didn't bark. He didn't come to me. He just watched the tree line and then, after a second, laid his head on his paws again, as if to say this situation did not require emergency procedures. I stayed where I was, another full minute, muscles keyed, then made myself move. I gathered 3 windfalls from near the root flare and set them in the basket. 2 were usable. 1 was split and sticky. I put the bad one in a deer pile. Habit steadied me. Work steadied me. I kept going. Near noon I noticed another thing. The ladder rungs I'd left leaf slick yesterday were brushed clean, everyone up to shoulder height, as if someone with broad hands had swiped them clear so I wouldn't slip. I ran a thumb along the wood. Dry, no leaf grit, no mud smear. Just clean. I looked around automatically for boot tracks and found only the churned prints I'd made, and Tractor's oval pads in and out between them. I sat on the overturned crate at last, ignoring the sting in my shoulder, and faced the orchard rows the way my mother used to when she was deciding what could be saved before a weather turn. Tractor came over and leaned against my shin again. The 2 stones were still on the crate beside me now, because without fully deciding to, I had moved them there when I sat down. 1 in each palm, I weighed them. Smooth. Ordinary. Out of place. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. That sentence landed complete, with no argument behind it. I had spent years reading roads by feel, judging soft shoulders and hidden washouts by sound and slope and the way gravel shifted under weight. You learn to trust your body when it tells you what kind of trouble is coming. Standing in that orchard with signs I couldn't account for and no witness but an old dog, my body said this was not trouble. This was attention. Careful, distant attention that kept finding ways to help without stepping into my space. That recognition unsettled me more than fear would have. Fear gives you procedures. This asked for something softer than procedures, and softer had never been my strength. Clouds thickened through the early afternoon, flattening the light until every colour went muted. I made 2 more trips to the porch with baskets not quite full because my shoulder wouldn't let me carry more. Each time I came back, Tractor checked the crate first, then trotted to my side. Each time, the orchard held that listening hush. Once, from somewhere in the trees came that same gentle leaf shift, then stillness. No rush, no display, just a presence choosing not to startle me. When I finally quit for the day, I stood by the crate a long moment and looked at the little cross of apples, now slightly dulled where the air had dried them. I took one of the creek stones, the grey one with the white seam, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The green one I left where it was. That felt fair, though I couldn't have said to who. "Come on, Tractor," I said. He rose, stretched his back legs one at a time, and followed me toward the porch. Halfway up the slope, I turned and looked back. The old tree stood dark against the low sky, branches moving just enough to show the wind had picked up. Beyond it, the tree line stayed quiet and deep and unreadable. I touched the stone through my jacket, felt its cool, round edge against my fingers, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just enduring the day. I was paying attention to it. At the porch steps, I paused and looked back down the slope, the basket handle biting my palm, the grey creek stone cool in my pocket, and I had the odd feeling that if I blinked too long, I'd miss another small instruction from the day. Tractor climbed up ahead of me, turned once, and sat by the door like he expected me to take attendance before going inside. I set the apples down in the kitchen sink, rinsed 3 for supper, and stood there chewing one over the counter while dusk slid across the window glass. Usually that hour was the heavy one. It was where my thoughts drifted straight to Ryan and stayed there. That evening, grief was still present, but it had company. Curiosity had elbowed in and taken a chair. I went back out with a flashlight before dark settled all the way, telling myself I was only checking whether I'd left the gate unlatched. The beam washed over the grass in a pale tunnel. Moisture had already gathered on the tops of weeds, each stalk shining where the light hit. At the orchard edge I slowed, listening. The same hush from morning had softened but not broken, as if the place had agreed to speak quieter than usual. I swept the beam over the ladder, then the crate, then the ground around the trunk. No boot tracks except mine, no tire marks, no cigarette ends, no candy wrappers, no little sign of a person being careless, which is mostly how people sign their names outdoors. What I did see was subtle enough. I almost passed it by. Along the uphill side of the tree, where windfalls tended to roll and split, good apples had been nudged into one shallow cluster near the basket. Bruised ones sat 5 feet away in a second cluster. Stems mostly turned the same direction, as if someone had sorted by touch instead of hurry. I hadn't done that. I sorted in my head, one by one as I picked. I didn't kneel and make piles. My shoulder wouldn't have allowed it. And even at my best, I wasn't that tidy. I stood there with the flashlight pointed at those piles and felt mildly foolish for whispering, "All right then," to nobody visible. The light caught vapor from my breath, thin and white. Tractor came up beside me and sniffed each pile in turn, then looked toward the trees with that calm, half-alert expression he wore around old farmhands and delivery drivers, people he recognized as part of the day. No growl, no stiffness. He gave a little huff and sat. Back inside, I heated soup and buttered toast and burned one slice because I was watching the yard instead of the skillet. I ate anyway. After dishes, I set the grey stone on the table near the salt shaker, then moved it to the windowsill, then finally put it on the shelf above the sink where my mother used to line up odd keepsakes from the property. A rusted square nail, a smooth deer antler point, a cracked blue marble she swore came from my grandfather's overalls. The stone looked at home there. I didn't question that too hard. Sleep came in patches. Shoulder pain woke me at 1, then again before dawn, and each time I listened for sounds outside that might explain the day in practical terms. Wind in cedar, one owl call from the north fence. Tractor's snore from his blanket by the stove. Nothing else. By the next morning, low cloud had rolled in from the west, flattening the light so the whole ridge looked sketched in pencil. I made coffee strong enough to raise dead batteries, pulled on 2 shirts and my work jacket, and headed down with a sound basket and a pair of pruning shears I mostly carried for confidence. At the tree, I found the first branch-level sign. A lateral limb that had cracked in last week's blow was no longer hanging. It had been lifted and held in place by 2 forked sticks, jammed into the ground and crossed under it like a brace. Not pretty, not carpenter clean, but effective. The apples on that limb were still attached and off the dirt. I crouched to inspect the sticks. Fresh breaks at the tops, bark peeled where weight had pressed down. Whoever did it had understood the point. Keep the fruit up. Buy another day or 2 before rot and frost did their work. I sat back on my heels and laughed once through my nose, because what else do you do when your orchard starts receiving anonymous structural support? If you're billing by the hour, I said quietly toward the tree line, I'm behind already. Tractor gave me a look that suggested I was handling this in a manner he considered uneven but tolerable. Then came the part that made the whole thing feel less like random oddity and more like collaboration. As I worked the lower branches, I noticed leaves and twigs brushed clear from the path between tree and porch, just enough to keep footing safer where the ground dipped. Not raked, not swept. Cleared in wide passes at shin level, the way a broad forearm might move if the person doing it didn't carry a tool. The path curved exactly where I'd been favoring my bad shoulder, taking pressure off my left side by giving me a gentler angle uphill. That was specific. That was observant. That was somebody seeing how I moved and making it easier without stepping in front of me. My mind ran the usual checks anyway. Neighbor kid, no prints, no chatter, no pranks, and none of the show-off mess boys leave behind. Bear. Bears don't sort produce and brace limbs. Mara. She lived 40 minutes away, hated cold mud, and texted in full sentences when she wanted credit. Fatigue making me misread ordinary patterns. Maybe once, not 3 times, not with that consistency. The prevailing logic of my life had always been simple. If something sounds strange, strip it down to parts and the mystery goes away. Standing there with my gloves damp and my shoulder burning, I stripped this down as far as it would go, and the mystery stayed put. By late morning, I had half a basket and a stiff neck, so I took a break on the crate. Tractor sprawled beside me with his paws crossed, breathing slow. I looked across the slope to where the old fence disappeared into alder and thought about how many months I'd spent trying not to need anything from anyone. Need felt dangerous because it could be refused. Need made you visible where someone might look and judge. Yet here was this nameless help, showing up in workmanlike ways that asked nothing in return. No note, no claim, no demand to be believed. Just assistance. The weather radio on my kitchen counter crackled faint through the open window from up the hill, a voice listing counties and temperatures in that flat tone that can make bad news sound like grocery items. Freeze warning remained in place, overnight lows dropping fast along ridges. I checked my watch, rubbed my shoulder, and went back to picking. My pace was slow, but it was steadier than yesterday. Every so often I'd pause, glance at the tree line, and say under my breath, "I see it," though I wasn't sure whether I meant signs, help, or my own reluctance finally loosening. The first real glimpse came toward dusk, and it arrived the way most true things do for me. Not with fanfare, just with details lining up until denial ran out of room. Clouds had thinned in streaks by then, and a low amber light slid in under them, turning the trunks copper on one side and charcoal on the other. I was at the base of the ladder debating whether one more rung was worth the pain when Tractor rose from where he'd been lying and faced the maples on the far edge, tail level, body loose. He took 3 steps forward and stopped. I followed his line of sight and saw motion between 2 trunks, slow enough at first that I took it for shadow shift. Then it stepped clear. It was larger than any man I had seen in person, easily 8 feet and change by the way its shoulder lined against a split oak behind it. Dark fur, not glossy, more like winter-thick undercoat catching light in brown threads where the sun hit. Chest broad, arms long, hanging easy at its sides. Nothing about its posture rid charge or challenge. It stood angled, not squared to me, giving me profile the way cautious neighbors do when they don't want to crowd a porch conversation. I didn't move. My breath shortened and then steadied. In my head there was a fast, useless stream of thoughts trying to regain control. This is a trick of distance. This is a hunter in a ghillie suit. This is your shoulder meds and bad sleep teaming up. But I could see the way its weight settled through the ground, could watch muscle shift beneath fur as it turned 1 foot and placed it down between 2 fallen apples, without touching either. That placement did something to me. Big shape, gentle step, power choosing restraint. The whole equation changed right there. Tractor looked back at me once, as if checking my settings, then sat down. Sat. In front of that massive figure, he sat like he was waiting for me to finish unloading feed sacks. I nearly laughed from sheer disbelief at my own life, because not 10 feet from my boot was a dog who had barked at lawn chairs in high wind, and now he was calm beside a creature that should have rattled him. I said very softly, "You know him." Tractor thumped his tail once against leaves and kept watching. The figure remained at what I judged to be 30 yards, maybe a touch more. Close enough to see shape and movement clearly, far enough to leave me room. Its head turned slightly toward the crate, then the basket, then my left shoulder where I'd been favoring the arm all week. Not staring hard, just noting. It took 1 step forward, paused, and when I tensed, it stopped immediately, then shifted its weight back half a pace. That adjustment was deliberate. It was the social equivalent of raising both hands and saying, "I'll stay here." I found my voice and heard how rough it sounded. "I'm Glenn." No response in words, none expected. The creature dipped its head once, slow and small, then lowered itself into a crouch near the edge of the maples, where fallen apples had rolled. It began with those huge hands to gather fruit one at a time and place each piece in a neat line on a flat patch of ground. Good fruit to one side, split to the other. Same sorting pattern, same quiet precision. Every movement was measured, almost careful to a fault, as if it knew exactly how much force lived in its body and had spent years practicing less. I watched long enough for awe to settle into something steadier. Not comfort yet, but an opening toward it. The evening air smelled of cold soil and crushed leaves. A woodpecker knocked 3 times somewhere up the drawer, then went quiet. My shoulder ached, my fingers were stiff, and still I felt a strange relief spread through me because the thing I had sensed for days now stood in plain view, and it was not there to take, frighten, or prove. It was there in the same way the braced branch was there, practical, attentive, patient. When I bent to lift my basket, it rose from the crouch and took 2 steps backward toward the trees, maintaining distance while keeping me in sight. I carried the basket to the porch in 2 rests, turned and saw it still at the edge, partly in shadow now, waiting until I was clear before it moved again. The rhythm held. I worked, it watched or sorted. I stopped, it gave space. Shared labor without contact, without demand, without hurry. By full dark, the figure had receded far enough that I could only catch portions between trunks. A shoulder here, the line of an arm there, then nothing but trees and dim sky. No dramatic exit, no crashing retreat, just a quiet withdrawal into the same woods it had come from. Tractor stood a moment longer facing that direction, then came to my side and leaned his weight into my leg. On the porch, with the basket at my boots and cold settling into my jacket seams, I looked down the slope where the orchard had gone to silhouette and felt my old certainties rearranging themselves like apples, set carefully into 2 honest piles. I stayed on the porch until the cold bit through my jeans and Tractor started shivering against my leg. The basket at my boots smelled sweet and earthy, and the whole slope below me had gone soft-edged in the kind of dark where distance becomes guesswork. I kept replaying that careful step between 2 fallen apples, the way a body that size had moved like it was trying not to disturb a sleeping room. Fear would have been easier to sort. Fear has compartments and instructions. What I had was stranger and, in its own way, harder. I felt considered. Inside, I set 3 apples on the counter and held one under the faucet longer than needed, watching cold water bead and run over red skin. Tractor drank, circled his blanket, and dropped with a grunt that sounded like old hinges. I should have eaten. I should have taken medicine and gone to bed like a sensible, injured man with weather coming in. Instead, I stood at the sink window, lights off, looking down toward the orchard until my eyes adjusted to the dark shapes. I told myself this couldn't hold up in daylight. Morning would flatten it into tracks and angles and practical reasons. Maybe I had overread a shadow. Maybe my tired brain had stitched ordinary things into a story because loneliness likes drama when it can get it. But that argument kept slipping on the same point. Whatever I had seen had backed away when I tensed. It had made room for me. That detail sat in my chest like a warm coal, small but steady. By the time the kitchen clock clicked past 10, I pulled my jacket back on and took the flashlight again. Tractor followed without enthusiasm, as if he was willing to supervise one more bad decision before filing a complaint. The beam bounced over porch steps, wet grass, the path between trees that had been brushed cleaner than I'd ever bothered to keep it. At the orchard edge, I stopped and listened. A light breeze moved high leaves. Somewhere far off, a screen door shut. Closer in, there was that same low, held quiet. "Just checking," I said to the dark, and immediately felt ridiculous. "And saying thank you, if that applies." The flashlight found the crate, the ladder, the 2 sort piles from earlier. Then it landed on something new at the base of the trunk. 6 good apples, in a shallow crescent. All stems turned inward as if cupped toward center. Beside them sat the green creek stone I'd left, and next to it, a second grey one with a narrow white seam nearly twin to the one on my shelf. I stood there with the beam fixed and my breath clouding in front of me. Nobody had to do that. Nobody had to carry creekstone up through alder in the dark just to complete a pair. Tractor walked past me, sniffed the crescent, then went and sat facing the maples. He wasn't rigid. He wasn't warning. His tail moved once against the leaves. I swept the flashlight toward where he looked and caught no full shape, just the briefest suggestion of depth between trunks that didn't match the trunks themselves. It shifted back, quiet as cloth sliding on wood, and was gone. "I see you," I said, barely above a whisper. "I'm heading in." Nothing answered except a soft leaf press from farther up the line, like weight relocating carefully. That was enough. I took one of the two matching grey stones, left the rest untouched, and walked back with Tractor pacing beside my knee. On the porch, I laughed once, low and disbelieving, because somewhere in my life's long record of practical labour, I had reached the entry that read, "Middle-aged road grader operator accepts decorative rock exchange with giant unseen orchard helper." If there had been a witness, I'd have denied it in court. I slept in short pieces, but the night had changed texture. I woke at 2 to shoulder pain and listened, and what I heard was not threat, but weather building. Gusts brushing cedar, the hollow tap of a loose gutter screw, rain that thought about starting and decided not yet. Near dawn, I gave up on bed, made coffee and checked the radio. Freeze warning still in place. Temperature dropping faster along Coldwater Ridge than in town. I looked at the two matched grey stones now side by side on the shelf and felt an odd, grounded certainty that I needed to keep working the tree while there was still time. At first light, a thin silver wash covered the orchard grass. Not full frost, but close enough to count as a warning. Tractor and I went down with both baskets, gloves, and the stubborn plan of finishing what I could from the ground. The tree stood dark and full against a low sky, fruit bright as signal lamps in the upper branches. I was sorting windfalls near the trunk when I sensed movement to my right and turned slowly. He stood at the same respectful distance as yesterday, maybe 30 yards, one shoulder partly behind a maple. In daylight, the scale hit harder. He was broad through the chest, long-armed, fur dark brown to near black, except where morning light picked out warmer threads along his back and forearms. His face was open and calm, amber-brown eyes steady and alert, without any hard edge in them. He watched me the way good stockmen watch a nervous horse. Present, patient, not forcing the pace. I raised my empty hand, palm out. "Morning." He dipped his head once. Then he lowered into that same crouch and began sorting windfalls from the far side of the tree, mirroring my work from his distance. Good fruit into one line, bruised fruit into another. When I shifted and winced, he paused. When I resumed, he resumed. The rhythm settled in so naturally I almost forgot how unlikely it was. An hour into that quiet labour, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket hard enough to make me jump. The creature stilled at once and eased 2 steps back toward the trees. I pulled the phone out and saw a county emergency alert stacked above the old message thread Mara had sent yesterday. Hard freeze warning upgraded, freeze line dropping tonight. Protect crops immediately. Same warning Ken Miller had repeated at the feed store, now stamped in all caps by the county like it could physically shove me faster. I looked up. He was still waiting without advancing, watching my hands and shoulders for cues. "Freeze lines dropping tonight," I said aloud, more to the orchard than to the phone. "We move now." The words sat in the cold air between us. I slipped the phone away, met those steady amber-brown eyes again, and heard myself say the truth I'd been circling since dawn. "I'm not alone out here." He didn't vocalize. He just held still, attentive, and calm, then returned to sorting as if that settled the matter enough for work. By late morning, clouds thickened and the wind shifted north. Every task took longer with one bad shoulder. Lift, sort, carry, stop, breathe. Each time I hauled a half-full basket uphill, he disappeared into trees. Each time I returned down the path, he was back at his station, either sorting or standing watch at distance. Once, when I dropped a glove and bent awkwardly, he moved one pace forward, then halted as soon as I straightened, reading my line as clear as any person could have. I started talking under my breath while I worked, not expecting response, just marking the shared hours. That one's gone soft. Good pile there. Wind's turning ugly. Saying those little things steadied me. The wonder stopped feeling sharp and started feeling inhabitable, like stepping into cold creek water and finding, after the first shock, that your legs could hold. By the second week of October's last days, the afternoon light already came in slant and brief, and this one faded early under cloud. Around 4, fine white grains began to move in the air, not snow exactly, more like dry ice dust skimming sideways. Black frost announcing itself. The grass at the orchard edge took on a pale rim. Tractor pressed close to my knee and sneezed once at the cold. I had one wicker basket left on the crate, and maybe 40 good apples still hanging too high for me to reach safely. I stood under the tree, looked up at fruit I couldn't get, and felt frustration rise, hot and useless. The old reflex was to push through pain, climb anyway, pay for it later. I set one boot on the first rung, felt my shoulder flare hard, and stepped back down, swearing quietly. When I turned, he was no longer at the tree line. He stood 10 yards closer, still angled, still careful, close enough now that I could see frost collect in fine points along the fur on his forearms. He looked from me to the ladder, then to the loaded lower branches, then back to me. I froze, basket handle in hand. He waited. I swallowed, nodded once, and stepped clear of the trunk, drawing Tractor with me. "All right," I said, voice thin in the cold. "Easy." He approached in measured steps, each foot placed with precision among windfalls. At the trunk, he set both large hands against the bark, not high, just chest level, fingers spread wide enough to span rough ridges my hand couldn't cover. He looked once in my direction, as if confirming I was clear. Then he gave the tree a controlled shake. Ripe apples dropped in a quick rain, thudding into grass and leaves around the crate, while smaller, hard fruit clung fast. He stopped at once. I moved in, gathered as many as I could, and loaded the basket. He waited. When I stepped back, he shook again, a little higher this time, then stillness. Another clean fall of good fruit, no snapped limbs, no wild thrashing. Measured force, pause, measured force, pause, like a man running a post-hole auger by feel, so he doesn't tear the earth wider than needed. We repeated that rhythm until the basket brimmed. My gloves were damp, and my fingers numb. Tractor moved between us calm as ever, occasionally nosing a rolling apple back toward my boot. Frost edged the crate slat silver. The wind sharpened. I reached for the basket handle and managed to lift it 2 inches before pain shot from shoulder to neck and made me drop it. He stepped forward 1 pace and stopped, looking directly at me. I stepped back and lowered my hand from the handle. "Go ahead," I said, and surprised myself again with how sure I sounded. He bent, took the basket in both hands with a delicacy that made my throat tighten, and turned uphill toward the house. I walked beside, and slightly behind, Tractor trotting ahead like this was ordinary evening business. Up the brushed path, past the gatepost, over the last rise to the porch steps. He mounted the first step, leaned in, and set the basket beside my door, with the same care my mother used when she set warm jars on a towel to cool. For a moment, None of us moved. Cold air burned in my lungs. The porch light cast a warm oval that caught in his fur and in the steam of our breath. He looked at me, and the calm in those eyes was so direct and unguarded it reached places in me I had kept boarded over for years. This kindness wasn't random. It was aimed at my work, at my pain, at a tradition I had almost let die because I didn't think I could carry it anymore. My eyes stung before I could stop it. I sat down on the top step because my knees had gone uncertain, pressed a sleeve to my face, and let the tears come without hiding. Tractor leaned his shoulder into my leg, solid and warm. The big figure remained where he was, not crowding, not retreating, just holding that respectful distance even on my porch. After a long breath, he reached into the basket, selected 3 unbruised apples, and placed them in a straight line on the porch rail like a final, gentle accounting. He gave one small nod, then turned and walked back down the path into fog-soft timber. Each step quiet, each movement unhurried, until dark, and trees took him in and left only the orchard, the frost, and a full basket by my door. I stayed on the top step with my forearms on my knees, breathing through the cold and the shaking, and watched the place where he had gone until my eyes watered for a second reason. The fog down the path had thickened into soft bands between the trunks, and every now and then a branch moved and then settled, but there was no grand final look back, no theatrical silhouette on the ridge. He had done what he came to do, then left me with the work finished and the basket safe by my door. Tractor pressed closer until half his weight leaned against my shin. I put my hand on his neck and felt the coarse fur damp from frost. My chest hurt in that old, familiar way, the way it did after funerals and hard arguments and nights when I opened Ryan's contact and closed it again. But this was different from those hurts. This one had space in it. I wasn't folded in on myself. I was open and raw and, against all practical expectation, grateful. "I know," I said to Tractor, though he hadn't made a sound. "I know." The 3 apples on the rail sat in a straight red line under the porch light, each one clean, dry, and unbruised. I looked at them a long time. My mother used to line jars that way after canning, shoulder to shoulder, not for show, just to count what was there and what would carry us through winter. Something in me recognized that little row as counting too. Not fruit exactly, care. I told myself I should stand up, get the basket inside, get ahead of the temperature drop, do what any reasonable man would do with weather moving in. Instead, I sat there a while longer and let the rest of it come out. All of it I'd been holding tight enough to make my jaw ache for 2 years. The shame over words I'd said too hard to Ryan, the stubborn silence after, the way I'd made injury into an excuse to disappear to this house and call it recovery, when a lot of it was hiding. I had been mourning my son, yes, but underneath that I had been mourning a version of myself I no longer trusted, a man who could build something instead of bracing for loss, a man who could accept help without hearing insult in it. The wind shifted north and came up the porch steps thin as wire. That got me moving. I rose carefully, shoulder protesting, lifted one side of the basket with my right hand and nudged it over the threshold with my knee. Tractor followed, toenails clicking on old plank. In the kitchen, the warmth from the pilot light and stove metal felt almost tender against my face. I set the basket on the table, then carried the 3 rail apples in one by one, placing them beside the matched grey stones on the shelf above the sink. 3 apples. 2 stones. Ordinary things, and now not ordinary at all. By the time I got water running in the sink, full dark had settled over Cold Water Ridge. The weather radio crackled near the bread box and spat out county names, temperatures, and warnings in that same flat official voice. Hard freeze imminent overnight. Protect remaining produce. Limit travel after midnight due to black ice on higher roads. I rinsed apples one at a time, sleeves damp to the elbow, and felt a laugh come up out of me, shaky but real, because for once, the warning felt late to the facts of my day. The produce was protected. The road could do what it wanted. I cut bruises out, quartered what would hold, set peels aside for mash, and started a stock pot with a splash of water and cinnamon from the back cupboard. Steam rose slow and sweet, fogging the lower window pane. Tractor stationed himself at his usual spot beside the stove, chin on paws, eyes half closed. Every few minutes I stopped and listened toward the orchard without meaning to. Not for danger, for presence. Once I heard a faint, distant leaf shift from down the slope, then nothing else, and that quiet felt less like emptiness than respect. The phone buzzed on the table and made me jump. Mara's name lit the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, wiping my hand on a towel. "You get anything off that tree?" she asked without hello. I could hear a TV in her background and cupboard doors opening, her evening in motion. News just said ridge temps are dropping faster than forecast. You need me to come up with totes? I can throw on boots. I got most of it, I said. My voice came out rough from crying and wood smoke and not enough sleep. Enough to matter. She paused, then softened. You sound like you've been through it. Shoulder flare? Shoulder, yeah, and I had help. I leaned on the counter and looked out at black glass where the orchard ought to be. I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to sort it out tonight. Just know I'm all right. Another pause, longer this time. Then she answered in the careful tone people use when they want to stay with you without pushing. All right, I don't need to sort it tonight. Lock your doors anyway, keep the stove vent clear, and text me a picture of what you got in the morning so I can brag on you. I can do that. And Glenn? Yeah. I'm glad you're not alone. The line went quiet after we hung up, and I stood there holding the phone, looking at my own reflection ghosted in the dark window. Practical men don't build theology from one sentence, but that one landed deep. I set the phone down and went back to the pot. Apples softened, skins curled. The kitchen filled with the smell of sugar and spice, and old cedar warmed from inside. I worked slowly, stirring with my right hand, letting the left rest, listening to the lid rattle now and then as heat built. At some point, I realized I was talking quietly while I cooked, not to fill silence, but to share it. Good haul tonight, I said toward the window. Thank you for the carry. No answer came in words, and none was owed. Still, speaking it out loud made it true in my body, not just in my head. Later, when the first batch was run through the mill and cooling in a wide bowl, I switched off the kitchen light and stepped back onto the porch with my coat open and steam still clinging to my shirt. The cold hit hard enough to sting my teeth. Frost had already silvered the top rail, and the yard grass glittered under a thin moon behind cloud. Down the slope, the orchard was a deeper black against black, the tree a rough shape with branches held still. Then, at the edge of the maples, I caught movement, a broad, dark form passing between two trunks, not approaching, not retreating in alarm, simply travelling along the margin of my light with unhurried purpose. He paused once, half-turned in profile, and that was enough for me to see the line of shoulder and head before he continued. One step, another, each placed with the same care I had seen at the tree. Then he was absorbed by timber and fog and distance. I stayed there with both hands on the rail until my fingers went numb, honoring that exit the only way I knew how, by not chasing it with noise or need. The crux of the whole thing settled over me in that minute. Kindness had found me without spectacle, and it asked me to receive it, not possess it. There is a trade-off in that kind of gift. You don't get proof fit for a courtroom. You get a changed way of standing in your own life. Inside, I checked the doors because Mara asked me to, banked the stove, and laid out clean towels for jars I'd fill when I reheated the sauce. I took one of the grey stones from the shelf and turned it in my palm before setting it back between the apples. Then, I wrote 3 words on a scrap of envelope and stuck it under the stone where I'd see it at dawn. Send Ryan box. I sat at the table after that, not doing anything useful for several minutes, just listening to the house and to Tractor breathing in his sleep. The ridge wind rose and fell. Ice ticked lightly against the window as the freeze took hold in earnest. I thought about the brushed path, the braced limb, the sorted fruit, the basket set down like borrowed tools returned in good order. A framework I'd lived by for decades had been strict cause and effect, measurable labor and measurable return. Tonight gave me a wider one. Work still mattered. So did attention. So did mercy delivered in plain actions. When I finally went to bed, shoulder-wrapped and socks on against the cold, I didn't reach for the phone and then set it down like usual. I opened Ryan's thread, typed 1 line, erased half of it, and typed again until it sounded like me. Got apples in before the freeze, made enough for sauce and pies. If you want, I'll bring you a box this week. I stared at it long enough to feel the old panic rise, that reflex that says, don't offer, don't risk, don't hand someone the chance to refuse you. Then I looked toward the kitchen doorway where a faint stove glow touched the shelf with the stones, and 3 apples lined beside them, and I hit send. The message whooshed out into the dark with no immediate reply. I set the phone face down, lay back and listened as black frost tightened its grip on the ridge outside. For the first time in a long time, the silence in that house did not feel like punishment. It felt like room. When I woke, the house was still dark, and the first thing I did was reach for the phone on the crate beside my bed. Ryan hadn't answered yet. I lay there listening to the stove tick and Tractor breathing at the doorway, and I expected the old drop in my gut, that familiar slide into regret. It came, but lighter. I'd sent the message anyway. That mattered. By dawn, black frost had laid a white skin over the whole ridge. The porch boards glittered. The hand pump handle was rimed stiff. I pulled on boots, stepped out with Tractor, and looked down the slope at the orchard. Every remaining apple still on the branches shone dull and hard, iced over, done for the season. The tree I couldn't have finished alone stood quiet and silvered, and the basket he carried sat empty by my door, where I had leaned it to dry. I walked down slowly, one hand on the rail at the steep part. The brushed path was still visible under frost, gentle curve and all. Under the tree, the 2 sort piles had frozen in place exactly where we left them. Good fruit and split fruit in separate mounds now turned to cold marbles. The forked sticks bracing the cracked limb held through the night. Crystals edged their bark like sugar. The green creek stone was still by the crate, and the cross arrangement from that first morning had long since been disturbed by work and weather, but I could still point to the board where it had sat and remember how my breath changed when I saw it. I crouched and picked up the green stone, rubbed a thumb over its smooth face, then set it back down on the crate. I kept the 2 matched grey ones on the kitchen shelf. The green one belonged to the orchard. That felt like the right way to leave the record. Back inside, I reheated applesauce until steam clouded the window and filled 8 jars, then set them in a row on towels the way my mother taught me. Lid, ring, wipe, tighten. Listen for the little ping as each one sealed. The 3 porch rail apples I handled separately. One had softened enough to cook, so I diced it into the last pot. One was perfect and went in the box for Ryan. The third I wrapped in newspaper and set on the sill beside the stones, not because it would keep forever, but because I wanted one untouched marker from that night for as long as it would last. At 8:30, my phone rang. Mara. "You alive?" she asked. "Road map says your hill is an ice rink." "I'm upright," I said. "Kitchen looks like a cider mill exploded." "Send me proof." I angled the phone and took a picture. Jars lined warm, pie cooling, tractor underfoot hoping for dropped crust. She called right back after it sent. "Look at you," she said, and I could hear her smiling. Then her voice gentled. "You sleep any?" "Some. Sent Ryan a text last night." A small pause. "And?" "Nothing yet." "That's still movement, Glenn. Don't talk yourself out of that." She took a breath like she was choosing words. "About what you said yesterday. About not being alone. I don't need details you don't want to give. I just need to know you're steady." "I'm steady," I said, and this time it was fully true. Stranger than I used to be, but steady. By noon, the sky stayed iron grey, and around 1 my phone buzzed on the table. "Ryan, got your message late. Sorry, I'd like that box. You home Saturday?" I read it twice, sat down, read it again, then typed with my right thumb while my left shoulder throbbed dull and manageable. "Home all day. Come hungry. Pie happened." He answered with a thumbs up, and, after a minute, "I can come around 10. 3 days passed with hard mornings and bright, brittle afternoons. I salted the porch, checked fence, and kept finding myself looking toward the maples out of habit. I never saw him again in those days, and no new signs appeared beyond what had already been given. The mystery stayed where it belonged, intact and unspectacular, folded into chores. Saturday came clear and cold. By 10:10 I had convinced myself I heard every engine on the county road except the one I was waiting for. Then Ryan's truck climbed the ruts and stopped by the gate. He stepped out in a tan work coat and knit cap, broader through the shoulders than I remembered, and greyer at the temples than a son has any right to be when his father still feels 35 in his own bad decisions. We stood there a second too long. Then he said, "Hey, Dad." "Hey, bud." He looked at my slingless arm, then at the porch. "Shoulder. Stiff but working. Yours? You still overdoing it at that machine shop?" He gave half a smile. "Inherited that from someone." That could have gone sharp in older years. It didn't. We carried the box inside together. Jars clinked softly. The pie smell filled the kitchen, cinnamon and butter and cedar heat. Tractor made one approving circle around Ryan and leaned against his shin like no time had passed. Over coffee, conversations started on safe ground. Weather, road contracts, his furnace that kept tripping a breaker. Then it reached the place we had both been walking around for 2 years. Ryan set his mug down and looked at the table grain. "I should have answered sooner last night." "You answered," I said. "I'm counting that." He nodded once, still not looking up. I got tired of feeling like every call was going to turn into accounting. Who was wrong? Who owed what? I didn't know how to do it without us both digging in. "Same," I said. I dug in plenty. I mistook being loud for being right, more times than I can defend. He finally met my eyes. "So what changed?" The crux sat there clean and simple. I could have told him every detail, the sorted piles, the braced limb, the basket on the porch, but this felt like a truth to carry carefully, not a story to force. So I gave him the part that belonged to both of us. "I got helped," I said, "out there in the orchard, in a way I didn't earn and couldn't control, and it showed me how much energy I'd spent refusing help from people who loved me, because I was scared it came with judgment." His jaw worked once, then eased. That sounds like you, yeah. Sounds like both of us. He let out a breath that looked like surrender and relief mixed together. Probably. After lunch, we walked to the orchard. Frost still clung in shaded spots. I showed him the braced branch, now dry and holding. I showed him the path curve where leaves had been cleared and never fully filled back in. I pointed to the crate where the green stones still sat. Ryan crouched, picked it up, turned it over, and set it back exactly where it had been. "Mom would have liked this," he said quietly. "The apples?" He shook his head. No, that somebody saw what needed doing and did it without making a speech. We stood side by side under the old tree, both of us with hands in our jacket pockets against the cold. Tractor ranged a little ahead, nose down, then came back and sat between us. Ryan glanced toward the tree line, then back to me. "You really weren't alone out here, were you?" "No," I said. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't laugh. He just nodded like a man receiving weather and deciding to trust the forecast. Before he left, he loaded the box into his truck and hugged me quick and hard, awkward at first, then firm. "I'll call Tuesday," he said. "Not for a reason, just to call." "I'll answer," I said. He did call Tuesday, and Thursday after that. Near the end of November, he came up again and helped me tarp the woodpile. Mara came Sunday with extra lids and took 4 jars home. Ken at the feed store looked at me over the counter when I bought salt and asked, "Get those apples in?" I told him, "Got enough," and he gave one slow nod like that settled a private ledger. At my follow-up in town, the clinic cleared me for light duty as long as I kept up the shoulder exercises. I pinned the PT sheet by the pantry door and quit arguing with the old range I used to have. This was my baseline now, and it no longer got to decide what I did with a day. By the first week of December, the 3rd porch rail apple on the sill had finally gone soft and wrinkled. I sliced out the good half and cooked it with oats at dawn, then rinsed the little paring knife and stood at the sink, watching steam drift over the yard. The 2 grey stones remained on the shelf between the salt crock and my mother's cracked blue marble. I never turned them into evidence for anybody. I never made a report. I kept them as markers of a moment when my framework widened. Labour and mercy, both real, both necessary. I returned the wicker basket to its nail by the porch each night. I left the green stone in the orchard through winter and into thaw. When spring rain came, it darkened and shone where it sat beside the crate, ordinary as creek rock, specific as a signature. I didn't see him again. Maybe that was the point. The help had been given. The season had turned. The rest was mine to live. What I carried after that was not certainty about what the world is made of. It was better than certainty. It was a quieter, more useful trust that kindness can arrive in forms I don't control, that pride is not the same as strength, and that being seen at your worst does not always end in judgment. Sometimes it ends with a full basket on your porch, 3 apples lined like a blessing, and a phone call you finally answer when it rings.